glad the jury really seen the truth, and I just want to thank God for letting us be here.
Tonight, after years of accusations, two former UT players are cleared of all counts of rape. After only an hour and a half, a jury found A.J. Johnson and Michael Williams not guilty. They were accused of raping a woman in Johnson's apartment in 2014. After the verdict was read, you could hear gasps from those in the courtroom, and the accuser left in tears. Reporter Cole Sullivan was there when it happened and spoke to Johnson, who says he's ready to start new.
Waiting your verdict, not guilty.
No reaction in the courtroom from A.J. Johnson
Waiting your verdict, not guilty.
or Michael Williams, as the jury declared them not guilty on all charges. Outside the courtroom, a different atmosphere.
Yeah, I just want to thank God. Without him, nothing been possible.
The verdict came after only an hour and a half of jury deliberations.
I'm grateful for their seeing the truth that Michael Williams is not guilty and has never been guilty of this crime.
The defense didn't call any witnesses, instead moving directly into closing statements.
Sometimes decisions are made in the heat of the moment.
In their final argument to the jury, the prosecution painted a different picture of the two men.
She said no, and they put their hands over her mouth to shut her up because they didn't want to hear it.
The accuser, who testified Wednesday, rushed from the courtroom in tears as the verdict was read. But one of the men she says raped her says he's ready to get back to work.
They saying I was a smaller guy than I am. I'm smaller now than I was back then, but actually I weigh 255 and I'm still ready to go.
Going on with his life 3.5 years after charges were first filed. In Knoxville, Cole Sullivan, Fox 43 News.
Again, that verdict was made after only an hour and a half of deliberations. We spoke to attorney Dennis Francis about the quick verdict. He says it usually means the state did not prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. He also brought up evidence that may have been deleted from the alleged victim's social media account. He says that may have swayed the jury's decision.
I think that the part of the proof was that that these had been, some of the stuff may have been deleted for a purpose of not bringing evidence forward. I think that may have had a big influence on the jury.
Francis says there's a possibility A.J. Johnson or Michael Williams could sue the alleged victim, but says after 3 years of investigation before a trial, they may just want to move on with their lives.